Thank you very much, Mr. Chapman. Well, a happy holy day and a happy first day of unleavened bread to all of you. It's been a nice weekend because outside of the Feast of Tabernacles, we don't necessarily get this many consecutive days in a row, with Passover evening, night to be much observed, and the Sabbath, and today, the first day of unleavened bread. We don't get that many days just to all come together and have Sabbath services together and have services together. So I've certainly enjoyed it, and I hope you all have done the same. It was also pretty nice to be back in Plainwell for a couple of days. For the past bit, we've all been meeting here every week in Grand Rapids, but it was nice to go back and see a little bit of the town. And in particular, I had half a thought when we were driving through downtown Plainsville that was like, what would be a fantastic thing? To go to one of the best little establishments down there and bring home a box of Sweetwater's donuts for the upcoming week. Now, wouldn't that just be great? Well, unfortunately, and alas, like many desires that have been had to have Chick-fil-A on a Sunday when they're all closed, my trip to Sweetwater's has been denied. And of course, we all know the reason for this, and that's why we are all here today. And for the next 7 days, we're going to be abstaining from leavened bread. And we know that these holy days, we are still in place, and we're still supposed to keep them under the new covenant. And we should be observing these days and, of course, not partaking of leavened bread during these days. But what are we supposed to be getting out of these days? I think it is important for us to remember what the leaven symbolizes, why we put it out of our lives, and what we should be replacing it with. Today, I briefly want to answer 3 questions about leavening as it relates to this week of the year, and what we should keep in our thoughts as we observe these days. The title of my message today is a question I think we should reflect upon over this coming week. And that is, what did you replace your leaven with? What did you replace your leaven with? Question number 1 of 3. Why does leavening represent sin? Leavening, as we all know, is an agent that has been used, and there's a variety of different ways that you can use different kinds of leavening to make bread rise. To be a little bit more technical and specific, leavening, according to the American Heritage Dictionary, is 1, an agent, such as a yeast, that causes batter or dough to rise, especially by fermentation, or 2, an element, influence, or agent that works subtly, English is hard, to lighten or enliven or modify a whole. In the Bible, of course, we see leavening used as a metaphor to represent sin in a number of different ways. One such way is that it is a historical reminder of sin, as it harkens back to the exodus of Israel from Egypt. As we heard in yesterday's messages, the Israelites had to leave Egypt in haste, and so they did not have time to leaven their bread, and they had to instead eat unleavened bread. Spiritually, this has made leavening represent the bondage of sin we used to be under, how the Israelites used to be in bondage to the Israelites, and then unleavened bread representing the new covenant that we are able to be in now that Christ redeemed us with his sacrifice, and likewise how God brought the Israelites out of Egypt across the Red Sea. Another way that leavening represents sin is that it's used to represent pride. Leavening makes bread puffed up, a phrase that we've grown accustomed to hearing as a quote from 1 Corinthians 5, where Paul states that the congregation in Corinth was puffed up in not addressing a case of blatant sin that was occurring in the congregation, and that the leavening was leavening the whole lump. But why does pride puff up? Why is that the phrase that is associated with leavening, or with pride specifically? And so to relate this to the metaphor of leavened bread fills more volume than its ingredients should allow for. This is because it's full of gases, either from the fermentation process or for some other chemical means like baking soda, that causes the bread to rise. Relating this back to human beings, somebody who is overly full of pride is trying to appear to be something more than their substance can support, like claiming more than they've actually achieved. In contrast, unleavened bread is an extremely humble kind of bread. It's exactly what it's going to appear to be. You put a flat piece of bread in your oven, it comes out as a flat piece of bread. It's exactly what it advertises itself as. Let's look at a biblical example of how pride tries to appear to be something more than the original substance. If you don't mind, you can turn over with me to Isaiah 14, and I'll start in verse 12. Isaiah 14, and I'll start reading in verse 12. How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you are cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation, on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet you will be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit. Here, we see clearly the description of the fall of Lucifer. And it's clear from this description here that Lucifer, who is described as the light bringer or the morning star, the son of dawn, had some substance to him. And indeed, he is described as being magnificent and holding a high station. But, like leavened dough, he wanted to be more than his substance allowed him to be. He wanted to exceed God's own power and glory. Like how this original sin was Lucifer's pride and arrogance in wanting to be better than God, I believe that all sin can be seen as a form of pride. While not always a conscious thought, all sin is a deviation from God's law. And this is an act of rebellion that says, hey, I, as a member of mankind, am capable of directing my own path. Of course, we know that it is not in man's place to direct their own path, as is stated in Jeremiah 10, starting in verse 23. O Lord, I know the way of man is not in himself. It is not in a man who walks to direct his own steps. And so sin is mankind's attempt to claim to be on God's level, to make their own laws, when in fact mankind is clearly nowhere near this capable. So we can see here a couple of ways that leavening represents sin. Leavening can be a historical reminder of the exodus from Egypt, which symbolized spiritual Israel's departure from the bondage of sin, and that leavening represents the sin of pride, which can be interpreted, in a way, as the root of all sin. Next question that I want to answer today. Why do we remove leavening from our homes and lives during this week? Well, if leavening represents sin, I think it's pretty clear that we should not be sinning, and we should remove sin from our lives. But why do we need to remove the leavening entirely? Can't we just, remove some of the leavening, or maybe remove the leavening from the loaf of bread we accidentally bought last week and that we didn't have time to eat and had to throw away? Well, unfortunately, no. As anyone who has baked knows, once you mix some leavening into a bread dough, you can't really reach in there and pull the baking soda back out or pull the little molecules of yeast back out, especially since, in particular with yeast, it will multiply and grow within the bread dough. This is also reflected in 1 Corinthians 5, and starting in verse 6, and I'll read a little snippet of this passage here. 1 Corinthians 5, starting in verse 6. Your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you are truly unleavened. As Paul states here, any amount of leaven will make a lump of dough leavened. Likewise, we know that any amount of sin makes one a sinner. God does not categorize sin by magnitude, and he does not count them by multitude. All sin is sin, and all sin is punishable by death. Therefore, we must remove all of the sin from our lives, as the only way that we can enter the kingdom of God. Another interesting aspect that I thought was particularly interesting about the concept of leavening is that physical leavening and leavening bread dough chemically alters it in a way that cannot be reversed, at least not in a way that you could still call the bread dough dough. I'm sure if you put it into a super collider and destroyed all the molecules in the bread dough, it might be unleavened, but it would no longer really be bread. And so this physical reminder reminds us that we cannot remove all the sin from our lives without God's help. God can do what we cannot, and only with the sacrifice of his Son can we begin the process of repentance and to have the sin purged from our lives. Only God can make our unleavened lump or our leavened lump unleavened again. In contrast, the only way we can get rid of our physical leavening is by discarding the lot of it. So, brethren, it's clear that we're supposed to remove the sin from our lives, and it's clear that we can only do so with God's help. Is there anything else we should be doing, though, during these days of unleavened bread? This leads me to my final question, question 3 of 3. What should we replace our leaven with? Here I'm going to read the rest of this passage in 1 Corinthians 5, and I'll start at verse 6, but this time going down through the rest of verse 8. So 1 Corinthians 5, starting in verse 6. Your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. As I mentioned earlier in discussing why leaven represents sin, here the lump of dough, or the lump of dough of the bread, represents our substance, our character. Paul says that we need to be keeping the feast with a different kind of bread, a different kind of substance and character, one of sincerity and of truth. This draws a parallel to the kind of spiritual fruits we need to be producing in our lives. I'll turn over to a passage in Matthew 7. I'll start in verse 17. Matthew 7, and starting in verse 17. Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. We bear fruits according to our kind, as Christ said here. This festival season represents our departure from bearing leavened fruits, or fruits of malice and wickedness, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5, to bearing fruits of unleavened, or fruits of sincerity and truth. Overall, I think that the days of unleavened bread are just as much about putting away the old sin and the old leavening, as much as embracing the unleavened bread, which is embodied by our partaking of this unleavened bread and embodying the righteousness of Christ's life in us. And so to answer the question, what should we replace our leaven with? It is that we are replacing our leavening with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth and producing good fruits. So, brethren, this upcoming week has a lot of physical symbolism for us to partake in. We're told that the leavened bread should be put away. Hopefully, with every morsel of unleavened bread that we eat this week, we're reminded of why we aren't eating the unleavened bread, or eating the leavened bread, for it represents the sin that we're trying to put out in our lives. And we're also reminded why we're eating the unleavened bread, for it represents the righteous character that we're trying to strive and build more and more in our lives. I hope you all have a good rest of your festival season, that you enjoy all the unleavened goodies that we were able to partake of and share yesterday, and that none of you are too tempted by Sweetwater Donuts.